Okay, this is Unit 2, Lesson 2, Protist and Fungi in the Diversity of Living Things. I am on page 92 if you're following along in your text. The essential question for this unit is what are protists and fungi? By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the characteristics of protists and fungi and explain how they grow and reproduce. So what are some characteristics of protists? On page 94. The kingdom Protista is a group of eukaryotic, meaning these organisms contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So this kingdom Protista is a group of eukaryotic organisms that cannot be classified as fungi, plants, or animals. Members of the kingdom Protista are called protists, which are a very diverse group of organisms. Many members are not closely related or are more closely related to members of other kingdoms, so classification of protists is likely to change. Most protists are single-celled organisms or unicelled organisms that cannot be seen without a microscope. Diatoms are single-celled protists that have cell walls with unusual shapes. Some have many cells and some live in colonies. Volvox, a kind of green algae, has cells that form spherical colonies. Some protists have structures for movement. Most protists that do move do so in order to find food. Protists have membrane-bound organelles, which are structures that carry out jobs inside a cell. Many protists have a contractile vacuole that removes excess water from the cell. So some protists move by using cilia or hair-like structures like these hairs here that beat rapidly back and forth. Other protists use a flagellum, a whip-like structure that propels the cell forward to move. Amoebas move by stretching their bodies, forming a pseudopod or false foot. Pseudo meaning false, pod meaning foot. When cytoplasm flows into the pseudopod, the rest of the cell follows. So how can protists reproduce? I'm on page 96 in your text. Most protists can reproduce asexually when the offspring come from just one parent. Every organism can produce offspring that are genetically identical to the parent. Protists can reproduce asexually by binary fission and fragmentation. During binary fission, a single-cell protist copies its DNA. The protist then divides into two cells, each of which has a copy of the DNA. In fragmentation, a piece breaks off of an organism and develops into a new individual. Many multicellular protists reproduce this way. Some protists reproduce sexually when two cells called gametes join together. Each gamete contains a single copy of the gene for the organism. A cell with one copy of genetic material is haploid. A cell with two copies is diploid. Each gamete comes from a different parent. When the haploid gametes join, the diploid offspring has a unique combination of genetic material. In some protists, generations alternate between using sexual and asexual reproduction. Haploid generation adults are called gametophytes. Diploid generation adults are called sporophytes. Diploid adults undergo meiosis to make haploid spores. Spores are reproductive cells that are resistant to stressful environmental conditions. These spores develop into haploid adults, which undergo mitosis to form haploid gametes. Two gametes join to form a diploid zygote, which grows into a diploid adult. This continuing cycle is called the alternation of generations. So here we have starting with a diploid zygote. Then we have our adult. Then we have our haploid spores, our haploid adult, our haploid gametes, and then our diploid zygote. So what are different kinds of protists? On page 98. Animal-like protists cannot make their own food. They get nutrients by ingesting other organisms. Many eat small organisms such as bacteria, yeast, or other protists. Most animal-like protists can move, allowing them to search for food. Fungus-like protists absorb nutrients from the environment. Many absorb nutrients from living or dead organisms. Fungus-like protists produce spores that are used in reproduction. Protists release the spores into the environment. The spores can survive through periods of harsh conditions. Plant-like protists are producers, which means they use the sun's energy to make food through photosynthesis. Single-celled, free-floating plant-like protists are a main part of the ocean's phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are tiny floating organisms. They provide food for larger organisms. They also provide much of the world's oxygen. Multicellular plant-like protists are called algae. All algae have the green pigment chlorophyll in their cells. Many have other pigments. Algae are grouped by color, which determines what wavelengths of light the algae can absorb. The three main groups are brown algae, red algae, and green algae. So what are some characteristics of fungi? I'm on page 100. Fungi are spore-producing organisms that absorb nutrients from the environment. Because they are so different from other organisms, fungi are placed in their own kingdom. Fungi are consumers, which means they cannot make their own food. They cannot move to catch organisms to eat. Fungi get nutrients by secreting digestive juices into a food source and then absorbing nutrients from the dissolved food. Many fungi are decomposers, which get nutrients from dead matter. All fungi are made of eukaryotic cells that have nuclei. Fungi are unique because their cell walls contain chitin, a hard substance that strengthens the cell walls. Some fungi are single-celled. Most are made up of many cells that form chains or thread-like fungal filaments called hyphae. Most hyphae in a fungus form a twisted mass called a mycelium, which makes up the major part of the body of a fungus. The thread-like hyphae, down here, make up the body of this mushroom. Most type of hyphae are underground. So how do fungi reproduce? Page 101. Asexual reproduction in fungi occurs in three ways. In fragmentation, the hyphae break apart and each piece becomes a new fungus. In budding, a small portion of a parent cell pinches off to become a new individual. In asexual reproduction by spores, hyphae produce a long stalk called sporogenium, in which spores develop through mitosis and spread by the wind. In most fungi, sexual reproduction occurs when hyphae from two individuals join together, producing a special reproductive structure. Genetic material from both individuals fuse to form diploid cells. These cells undergo meiosis to become haploid again. The spores are then released. Like asexual spores, these spores also spread easily through the environment. So what are some different kinds of fungi? On page 102 in your text. Zygote fungi are named for sexual reproductive structures that produce zygotes inside of a tough capsule. Most of the fungi in this group live in the soil and are decomposers. A mold is a fast-growing fungus that reproduces asexually. Bread molds and molds that rot fruit are examples of the asexual stage of a zygote fungus life cycle. Sac fungi, the largest group of fungi, includes yeast, powdery mildews, morels, and bird's nest fungi. Sac fungi reproduce asexually and sexually. Sexually produced spores develop within a microscopic sac and then opens to release the spores. Most sac fungi are multicellular. Some single-celled sac fungi reproduce asexually by budding, which occurs when new cells pinch off from existing cells. Club fungi are named for the microscopic structures in which the spores develop. Club fungi are important decomposers of wood. Without fungi, the nutrients in wood could not be recycled. So how do fungi form partnerships? Page 103. Some fungi grow on or in the roots of plants, providing nutrients to the fungus, which helps the roots absorb minerals. This is called a mycorrhiza. Some fungi grow on or in the roots of plants, providing nutrients. A lichen, is a partnership between a fungus and a green algae or a cyanobacterium, which uses photosynthesis to make food. The fungus gives protection, water, and minerals. For example, lichens provide food for animals in polar climates.